right, welcome everybody. This is Patrick Field from the Consensus Building Institute, and I have several colleagues here. We'll do introductions in just a second. It's about 11:31 now, so I think we're going to go ahead and dive in. Really appreciate people joining us and really excited to be having this conversation with everybody. So I'm going to give just a little bit of instruction on Zoom, which most of you are familiar with. We're using the webinar capacity as the way to do that. And then I'll kind of go through our flow, again, give you brief guidance on Zoom, and then I'm going to turn it over to Russell to kind of set the stage and introduce things. And then we're going to dive right into our two really terrific panelists. So on Zoom, which many of you are probably increasingly familiar with, there's a few things on the webinar feature that you need to know. So on the participant list, which is on the little dock on the bottom of your screen, you actually can go and you click on that and you can actually, I believe, see the participants there. We have you muted officially from our end just to kind of manage sound quality and also any security issues. So during our two presentations, we're also going to have Q&A, but during our two presentations, we're going to really let them kind of run for about 15 minutes each. If you do have questions as they go, you can write a question into the Q&A. And myself as the moderator may interject a fewer times to try to get at least a few of those in. So during our presentations by our panelists, it will be only Q&A in writing in that way. And again, it's just to control sort of sound and security. When we're done with that, and we really have about hopefully 15 minutes for just broader conversation and questions, then actually in the chat function, which you have in front of you, you can actually just raise your hand. And at that point, I'll remind you, and you just raise your hand, hit that little icon, a hand raise will go up. Sophia will unstick you or unmute you, and then I will call on you to make a comment or the like. And we'll go through that run as well. So panelists, I assume you can hear us okay? Okay, good, all right. Really appreciate everybody joining. My name again is Patrick Field from the Consensus Building Institute. This is Russell Crumnow from Convergence Center for Policy, and I'm really going to turn over to Russell to really open us, and I'm going to share a screen to just share some slides.
Terrific. Good morning. Hopefully folks can hear me okay. I'm going to just do some brief context setting here using the slides you've got hopefully visible, and then hand it off to Pat to jump into a really rich conversation. We know this is unusual and difficult time, and a lot of folks have tough things going on in your personal life. So we appreciate people joining the conversation today. Hopefully this is enlightening and solution oriented amid a tough time as our country grapples with how to do really big, important stuff like keep our democracy in a good place as we look ahead, and we make sure that we have institutions protected that can give everybody confidence in the outcome of our elections. Really quick context on who you're hearing from. I know looking at the participant list, we have some friends and family that are on, which is great, who know us well, and possibly some folks who got this notification who do not know us as well. So welcome to all. My name is Russell Crumnow. I'm representing Convergence on the call today, along with a number of colleagues, Omar El-Khatib and others who are here from our team. We're an 11-year-old nonprofit who convenes organizations and individuals across differences to solve problems by finding consensus and common ground. We do that by doing a lot of listening, and then by convening people in very intentional dialogue processes, and then helping those stakeholders take action after they've been in dialogue. Consensus Building Institute is our fantastic partner organization that often comes in and serves as facilitators and mediators and consensus builders as a part of those dialogue processes. We've had a rich partnership for many years, and our team has worked closely with Pat and his colleagues on this particular effort around elections. So thrilled to be joining together and offering this webinar today. So quickly setting some context on what we're hoping to talk about in this next hour. The discussion today is really going to be with two county election officials who have expertise, who just recently conducted primaries in Florida and in Michigan, and I'm going to give you their intros in just a second. But the goal of today is both to look back at their experience leading those primaries and implementing them on the ground, and also to look forward and to think about what lessons we've learned and what might be done between now and November in this environment where we continue to see the pandemic unfold and aren't sure of exactly what will be happening on the ground in November, and wanting to get ahead of that. So stepping back with a little bit of context, I think as folks know, but I want to share a little background here. Convergence has been exploring with our partners at CBI over the last year a potential project on elections, bringing our dialogue to action model to bear on this really important topic. We know many of you on the call and others around the country are doing great work on elections, and so we hope this effort today and our larger effort adds value to the great work happening in communities, in states, and certainly at the federal level. Over the last year, we've been conducting interviews with people, both who administer elections, who advocate, who fight hard for their parties to win, who fight hard to ensure everybody can vote who should be able to vote. We've had a wide range of conversations to inform our thinking on what a Convergence elections project could look like. And after looking through a bunch of different potential approaches, where we sort of landed was a project that really looked beyond the next election and actually attempted to envision or re-envision what a really well-run American election would look like that did two things. That made sure everybody who should be able to vote gets to vote, and anybody who should not be voting is not able to vote. But more importantly than that, even inspired confidence in the public that the process was understandable and transparent, and that at the end of the day, when the dust settled, we could fight really hard for our side to win and still be comfortable and confident that the outcome was legitimate, even if sometimes in a democracy in a big diverse country when our side might lose. So we've been working on what a dialogue around that set of goals would look like. Some of you have been interviewed as a part of that process. We're really grateful for your input. We are continuing to learn. We are continuing to pursue that project. And we would welcome today, if after this discussion, you're like, you know, I actually have some thoughts, or I actually know a funder that might want to fund such a dialogue to help move our elections forward and think about them in a new way. We would welcome that input. So please reach out to me, to Pat, to Omar. Even as we do that longer exploration on what a long-term set of reforms to improve elections might look like, we know there's some urgent issues right now. And so because we've been in this space and building a network of connections around the democracy and elections world, we recognize maybe we could add some value by hosting a conversation like today's, and we may do more of these. Today's a chance to learn. And we're so grateful to have Brian Corley, from Florida, and Barb Byrum here from Michigan as our expert speakers today, who are going to take us through this conversation that is less about that long-term look that Convergence was engaging in and more a response to the crisis facing us right now. We're going to address some of the questions on your screen. Pat's going to take us through a conversation with these two leaders and let them respond to some of these questions. We're also going to be responsive to the questions you might have to add to this list that you can share in the chat as you're thinking perhaps long-term or perhaps short-term, depending on where you sit in the democracy and election space, or just as a concerned citizen who's joined us today. So with that context setting, thanks again for joining. Let me just briefly introduce our two speakers, and then I'll hand it to Pat, who will guide us through today's conversation, and we'll all keep an eye on the chat for folks to elevate your own questions as well. Brian Corley, one of our two panelists today, has been serving the citizens of Pasco County in Florida as their Supervisor of Elections for a number of years, since 2007. And he's presided over 30 elections in that time, with more than 1.5 million votes cast just in the jurisdiction he oversees. He's state certified as an election administrator by the Florida Department of State and is the past president of the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections. Brian has been a resident of Pasco County since 1979 and a proud graduate of the schools in Pasco County. Nationally, Brian Corley has been a featured speaker and a panelist with such groups as the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Elections Assistance Commission, the Center for Internet Security, and the Peer Charitable Trust's Voting Information Project, to name just a few. Brian's also been a generous participant in Convergence's own effort to assess a potential project on elections, joining both individual and group conversations and lending enormous insight. And we're incredibly grateful that Brian connected us to his colleague Barb, who is newer to our network, and we're so thrilled she's on today as our other speaker, who's going to take the reins here in just a second. Barb is currently in her second term as the Ingham County Clerk in Michigan, serving as that county's chief elections official, among her many other responsibilities beyond elections. As clerk is one of the more populous counties in the state of Michigan, Byrum has successfully conducted 24 elections, 4 union elections, and she was one of the critical counties that did conduct recounts after the 2016 presidential election. So she's had that experience in addition to the more recent elections that have occurred. Barb currently serves on Michigan's Election Security Commission, the Secretary of State's team of advisors tasked with strengthening and better securing elections in her state. She's also a member of the Overseas Voting Initiative. Byrum previously served 3 terms in the Michigan State House as a representative, serving House District 67. So she's both been an elected official in the state legislature and now in this role as a county official. Brian and Barb, thank you so much. Pat, I'm going to hand it back to you. And thanks everybody for joining in and listening and offering your questions as we jump in to this rich, important discussion.
Great. Russ, Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So first, we really want to turn to Barb, and it's really in part because of the order in which the primaries occurred between Barb and Brian as this crisis unfolded. And so we've really asked both of our panelists to really cover three general topics in about 15 minutes each. And after each, we'll leave a little time. If any questions came up in the Q&A, we'll ask them of you, Barb and Brian, for me, the moderator, for that first part. And we really want to know, what did the kind of unfolding crisis or changes day to day practically really do to voter turnout in terms of who showed up at the polls? You can describe a little bit in your state what early voting you do or don't have, who did or didn't show up at the polls in terms of demographics. We'd love to learn more. Secondly, we'd like to know what you began to do for the sort of health and safety of both voters and poll workers actually at the polling stations in person. And then lastly, because you've now gone through this and kind of had a practice in the primaries in March, what you think are some really important lessons for the November election, for the general election. So we really look forward to hearing from your great and very on the ground experience. And Barb, I'm going to turn it over to you. Sophia's going to unmute you, and it's over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Would someone shake their head if they can hear me well enough? All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about elections in Michigan. I would be remiss if I did not mention that the presidential primary election that I'm about to discuss, happened in March, in early March 10th, quite frankly. And that was before COVID-19 cases in Michigan were announced. In fact, it was election night that we found out about the first case. So on election day, it started progressing, some of the awareness, but it wasn't where we are today. So it wasn't the pandemic in my state as we are today. I think a lot of the increase in AV, absent voting, in Michigan, not just Ingham County, was the direct result of the passage of Proposal 3 in 2018. So this is a new opportunity for Michigan voters to exercise their right to vote via mail. Some states call it vote by mail. Michigan, it's absentee voting, it's AV voting. And in Michigan, the voter must request the ballot in writing to the local clerk, not the county clerk, but the local clerk. And then that local clerk will send the ballot to that voter. And then the voter has until polls close on election day to get that ballot to the local clerk. So I wanted to highlight those caveats because they are different. And also the presidential primary election in Michigan was earlier than certainly it was down in Florida. So in 2016, if we just look at the presidential primary in 2016, Ingham County experienced 68,783 total turnout of votes. In 2020, so this past presidential primary election in Michigan, we had 75,660. What's important, though, to note is as a result of the passage of Proposal 3, making voter participation a little bit easier, we saw an increase from 19.5% absent ballots voted in 2016 to 44.45% AV votes. So 44.45% of the votes voted for the presidential primary were voted by absentee ballot. That's a significant increase. And in fact, it's twice as many ballots than we received in 2016. I think this is a direct result of allowing people the opportunity to vote by absentee ballot. It wasn't really a result of a contentious Republican primary, if you'll remember who all was on the ballot. So I would expect this to increase over time. In Michigan, we have a May special election. Ingham County does not, but 30 of Michigan's 83 counties do. So some of the things that the governor and Secretary of State have been doing is the Secretary of State actually mailed to all qualified registered voters an application for an absentee ballot for this May special election. This is a direct result of COVID-19. Encouraging people to vote by mail, vote by absentee ballot. What's interesting to note, though, is the former Secretary of State of my great state and now a senator is calling for the cancellation or at a minimum postponement of the May special election. So these are the things that are going on right now that we're discussing right now. Other things we're discussing is delaying candidate filings. Right now, in order to appear on the August primary ballot, one must file their candidacy paperwork with their local or their city, depending upon the office they're running, by the 21st of April. So there's discussion about extending that or maybe decreasing the number of petition signatures for some offices. So these are things that are just now starting to be discussed in regards to upcoming elections. But for that March 10th presidential primary in Michigan, we didn't have the full impact of COVID yet. During election day, we were hearing we received some information from the state probably about 4 or 5 days before the election. Have hand sanitizer available, have tissues available. During election day, I did alert everyone to stop using hand sanitizer and handling ballots. Don't have wet hand sanitizer on your hands when you touch a ballot because that gums up the tabulator. It's those kind of things that we had to address on election day. But the increase that we've seen, that we saw for the March 10th presidential wasn't the result of the pandemic, but rather the result of the opportunity to vote by absentee ballot.
Great, Barb. And do you, a question for you, do you have thoughts about, given what you experienced as this was just becoming in a big way on everybody's radar, what lessons you've taken from this as you think about the November election in terms of, you already mentioned what the governor has done to try to increase kind of use of absentee balloting. Are there other things at the polls or other advice you have for other election directors across the country, or just to think about how this is going to affect the general election in November, recognizing each state has a very different way of voting in some cases?
Yeah, so some of the things that I have been advocating for is a change in state law. In Michigan, absentee ballots may not start being processed until polls open on election day. And what that means is ballots aren't going to be tabulated by the time polls close. So I have been an advocate even before the presidential primary, quite frankly, in Michigan. I'd been an advocate for allowing our local election officials, so not me, just the city and township election officials, to start the process of opening those absentee ballot envelopes and start flattening out the ballots so that when the time comes to feed them through the tabulator, they have at least a lot of the labor intensive portion done. Now we're also considering it's like an assembly line when processing absentee ballots, and perhaps that needs to change now. The less people in a room, the better, we know. So that's a consideration. Allow for the processing of absentee ballots earlier. That will take a change in state law. Also encourage more people to vote by absentee ballot. I did a mailing. The Secretary of State's office has done a mailing for this election. In Michigan, we have a permanent absentee ballot list. Many clerks have it. It is not required, but many clerks do have a permanent absentee ballot list. And what that means is for every election, that local clerk will send an application to that voter to fill out, complete, send it back to get the absentee ballot mailed to them. And perhaps we should do some more pushing to increase that permanent AV list for our local clerks. Ultimately, I personally believe we should just go to mail elections, but I don't believe my legislature is there yet. But I do look forward to that
Great.
as well.
I have a question from David Levine, and he said, Michigan election officials at all levels have taken a number of steps to prepare for the threat of foreign interference in 2020 elections. With the spread of coronavirus, do you have advice for how local and state election officials can simultaneously address both the virus and the threat of foreign interference?
I think the most secure way to conduct an election is via paper. I believe in paper ballots. Before I became an election official, I didn't understand why I couldn't just vote from my phone. I do my credit union and my banking from my phone. But elections and our democracy, there is no insurance for the protection of our vote. So I think the first step would be making sure our elections are run on paper, not DREs, but actual paper ballots that are physically put through the tabulator. I think we need to, as the United States, I think we need to look at other ways to hold our election vendors accountable. In Ingham County, we do the programming in-house. Many counties do not program in-house. But we also need to talk about how those updates are made on our election systems and what parameters our vendors are being held to. Can they use a jump drive for every county's election server, or do they need a new jump drive? Just simple, what I would think now, simple election security, cybersecurity practices. I've learned quite a bit through through my participation in DEFCON. I'm also terrified, but I think there are many things that election officials can do, but in the end, we are mitigating the risk.
And do you want to, I think, again, from a security standpoint, there's a lot of reasons why paper ballots are attractive, including the paper trail and the like. Question though, because now people are touching them, and so we're worried about transmission. Have there been some thought about how to handle that question of the fact that the ballot itself, maybe it's incredibly low probability, could itself actually be a transmission of the virus?
Yeah, so I think we will be learning more as time goes on, but I would envision masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer. And if someone votes by absentee ballot, votes by mail, then those election officials that are receiving the ballot would then, hopefully less of them now, just because the less people in a room and the less touching, the better. But then that would go directly into the tabulator. They are then kept in ballot containers. Depending upon what election will depend upon the retention rate. The only time that they are taken from those ballot containers, excuse me, is if there is a recount or an audit. In Michigan, we do audits. We did audits before audits were cool. Now we hear a lot about risk limiting audits, but we do hand count, physical audits, in addition to some pilot risk limiting audits. And I think audits are important, but given the concerns for public health, I think audits are going to be done differently. Not sure how that's going to look.
Great, Barb, thank you. And there's just one thing noted. I think one of our attendees said that CDC has stated, and the U.S. Postal Service has reiterated, that virus does not live long on paper. So hopefully that's good news. I've got two other questions for you. I think then we'll go to Brian. So this is a little bit apart from kind of the coronavirus and safety, but someone raised the question about paper ballots themselves. Or claim voting by mail may invite other kinds of corruption like ballot harvesting. And I don't know if you want to speak just briefly to that issue before I go to one more question before we go to Brian.
Well, voting by mail, I mean, so in Michigan, one must request their ballot by mail. They can still go to the polls. Even for this May special election, voters can still go to the polls and exercise their right to vote in person. Michigan, under that Proposal 3 in 2018 that passed, individuals also have an opportunity to register to vote and vote on election day. So there will still be some interaction with the local clerk. But the only way to get a ballot is to request a ballot. And that is done via written instrument under state law and with a signature. Signatures are compared. So I am very confident in the security of our elections. The ballot then is mailed back or dropped off in a drop box. Some of my local clerks have drop boxes. And then it is received in. There's a lot of back checks in the end to make sure only one ballot was issued to a voter. Sometimes they need to spoil their ballot. There's a process for that. We have the qualified voter file, which has a list of all of our qualified registered voters in the state of Michigan. So it's checked by multiple clerks, multiple local clerks, to make sure that voter is only getting one ballot. I think the allegations that mail elections are not secure is fundamentally rooted in the misunderstanding of elections and how dedicated our election officials are to making sure we have safe and secure, accurate elections.
Great, thanks, Barb. Okay, one last question for you, then we'll give you a break and go to Brian. So the question came from Aaron and one of the attendees, and it says, do the big urban counties have the capacity and systems to process the potentially massive surge in absentee requests and or ballots, both the request and the ballot itself coming in? If not, what is likely to happen in November if we are still under these kinds of conditions we are today? Yeah,
so in Ingham County, so Ingham County it's a larger county in the state of Michigan, but I have the Michigan State University. It's an amazing university. And in Ingham County at 2 a.m., was when I received the last upload of absentee ballots from one of my local municipalities. And I'm not a Wayne County, so I don't have the huge city of Detroit. And so I do have concerns, and they are valid concerns, and they've proven out over time, quite frankly, that locals just don't have the resources or the flexibility to process those absentee ballots timely. They're not allowed under state law to start opening envelopes until polls open on election day, so 7 a.m. They often lack sufficient amount of tabulators, certainly lack sufficient amount of employees, precinct workers, precinct inspectors, election workers, whatever they're called in your state. We don't have enough, and there's not enough time, there's not enough resources. So the locals really are going to struggle with having an opportunity to tabulate all of the ballots on election day unless the Michigan legislature steps up and allows for earlier processing, not tabulation, earlier processing, additional resources for high-speed tabulators, and somehow they find more people, because even this past presidential election, there were quite a few people that called in sick on election day.
Wow, very good. Great. Oh, thank you. There's a few more questions. I'm going to kind of move to Brian, and maybe we can come back to some of the others. So Barb, thank you so much. Really terrific, great experience, and all the practical things some of us not in elections today probably don't even have to think about, and you're really thinking about them each and every day.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Brian, over to you, and let's kind of share your experience and kind of describe where you were in the pandemic cycle as your primary went on, and we look forward to hearing from you. So Sophia, if you can make sure that Brian can speak.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here, and it's hard to top my colleague Barb with her knowledge and experience. So looking back, you know, as I told a reporter recently, it's challenging enough being in elections administration, and then on top of that, throw in being in the nation's largest battleground state. On top of that, being immersed in all things cybersecurity the last 3.5 years. And you think, how much worse can it get? And then you throw in a pandemic. I told the reporter, you know, what's next? Locust? Where do we go from here? Just beyond challenging, obviously. When we look at turnout, we were down about 30% from the 2016 PPP. You know, a lot of, when you look at turnout, you have to compare apples to apples. You can't look at, you know, compare the 20 presidential preference primary to the midterms, for example. You have to look back at 16. But in 2016, we did not have a pandemic, number one, and also it was a wide open field on both the Republican and Democratic side. So that would explain to some degree the decrease in turnout. One of the things I found really interesting, though, was in our county, in my jurisdiction, we saw the Republicans who, you know, for all practical purposes, it's decided, although it was a formality in that the nominee would be President Trump, clearly, they had more votes cast than the Democrats through Election Day, about 3 p.m. And I can't wrap my arms around that, because there seemed to be, as a Democratic voter, more of a wide open field, if you will. I don't really know how to analyze that. I don't think it was so much the pandemic than anything else. But what we saw was clearly an increased utilization and requests for vote by mail. We used to call it absentee voting in Florida. Now it's called vote by mail. It wasn't so much a spike related to the ongoing or soon to be pandemic. We've seen an uptick gradually over the past probably decade or so. In Florida, it used to be, you used to have excuse to have an absentee ballot, and then it was a witness requirement, and that went away with. And so now a voter can have one, in essence, permanently. You can get it through 4 years or 2 cycles. So we've been heavily promoting that. One of the things I found interesting is we have 3 cities that are scheduled to have elections next Tuesday. I have petitioned the governor to delay those out of concern and welfare and safety of the citizens. But we did a mailing to those respective municipalities. And I call this the hook, because we have many voters in Florida who will get a vote by mail ballot and still won't vote for a primary or a municipal election. It's sitting on their coffee table. And I tell the political parties and the candidates, you have to have the hook to motivate voters why they should return that. So we did a mailing to the voters in those respective municipalities in reference to the coronavirus and social distancing and the merits of voting from home. And we saw an average of maybe 5 to 10 requests prior to that went up to several hundred a day. So 5 to 10 to 200. The point is, voters get it. And when you explain to them that coming to vote at an election day polling place can be problematic, they understand that. Now in Florida, our model had changed. Our model had been election day was the show. And now we're a 3-legged stool where you have early voting, vote by mail, and of course, election day. And we're now at a point where it's pretty much statistically on par to have 2/3 of your votes cast before election day, meaning vote by mail or early voting. Early voting is a large facility. We have it between 8 and 14 days, and we custom print your ballot. It has evening hours, weekend hours, so it's been very, very, very well received, if you will. So, you know, again, there definitely was a decrease. We had some challenges. There's no getting around that. We lost a good number of poll workers and some polling places, and that's something we never dealt with. You know, it was a good lesson in having to pivot and kind of think on the fly, if you will, and certainly be creative. Something that Barb alluded to, we also are in Florida changing a few things. Our Secretary of State issued an executive or emergency order that allows candidates to now have their petitions to make the ballot. It can be an electronic signature, whereas under Florida law, it had to be a wet signature, and they've relaxed that rule. So for candidates who want to make the ballot, they have about a month or so from today to submit that electronically. So we've had some challenges, but we'll, like most things, we'll get through it together.
Great, Brian. Great. Do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, in terms of kind of safety at the polls? I mean, again, you sent out that mailing. A lot of people stayed home and voted via sort of the vote by mail. What other things did you do at the poll? What kind of challenges did you encounter with people? Did you set up tape and have people 6 feet apart? To kind of describe the mechanics of how you handled the voting day.
It's hard to imagine there was a time before social distancing that wasn't really even used back when we had our PPP. It was talked about. We subscribed to the CDC guidelines. We distributed posters. We trained our poll workers in advance of election day to use those CDC guidelines. You know, wash your hands thoroughly, and if you're not feeling well, don't show up. Some of us took us up literally on that. We provided sanitizer. I had ordered a particular vendor, and it was on back order. It was tentatively scheduled to get to us the day before election day, and I wasn't comfortable taking that chance, and so I ordered from vendor B, and we got it. Would you believe the first order actually came in on election day, 4 p.m. So I'm glad we went with option number 2, if you will. We provided disinfectant wipes, and we encouraged our poll workers to wipe down everything and anything they felt comfortable doing. And I know, seeing some of the situation reports, there was reports of scanners that wouldn't work because there's so much sanitizer in the channel markers, if you will, which is a problem. One of the most innovative things that we did that was so simple, it was well received. We put the ballot inside a secrecy sleeve. Made the decision, it's only a one contest ballot, so obviously only one side. Made the decision to not issue secrecy sleeves unless the voter really, really wanted it, because you could take the ballot to the privacy booth, complete it, and simply turn the ballot over and put it in the scanner, and that way you didn't need a secrecy sleeve, because those things are like, they look like menus, that consistency, a giant germ magnet. So something simple like that we ended up doing. So, you know, we did a whole bunch of things and just tried to, we should try to buffer privacy booths, for example, spread them out, if you will, if we had the means to do that. We did most times. We didn't have a tremendous election day turnout, but we did what we could to try and distance people as much as possible. And you know, overall, I think it was successful.
Great, Brian. Thank you. Say a little bit about what, you know, for you are implications now for November, given what you've experienced, what you've been seeing. We obviously don't know where we'll be at in terms of people staying at home or not come November. So what are really lessons for you as you prepare for the general?
Well, we know this, elections aren't an option. We have to have them. They're spelled out in the Constitution. And the biggest lesson I learned was, you know, I've dealt with impending hurricanes. You've even had a sinkhole incident on election day. Never in a million years that I think we'd be dealing with a pandemic. It's a great lesson, and all of us have worked very hard over the years to work on our continuation of operations plan, or COOP plan. And while that's a wonderful document and a great endeavor, it forces you to think of every possible scenario. What I learned was you have to be innovative and pivot on the fly. I mean, you can't just stop and whip out your COOP plan to figure out what you're going to do. You have to make some executive decisions, battlefield decisions, if you will. Being creative, you know, like, for example, we lost a good number of poll workers, and I don't blame them. The average poll worker age in my jurisdiction is 66 years old, right in the wheelhouse for those that should stay home according to our government. So what we ended up doing, we lost several hundred. We reached out to, because our schools were closed, reached out to our school superintendent, our local sheriff, our county administration, and we were able to make up the poll workers we lost, and they were able to help us out on election day. We learned the value of how important your training manuals are. we had individuals who did not have any formal training that showed up on election day. We were able to train them on the spot, and some of them had very responsible positions, such as the modeming of our unofficial results and closing down the equipment. They were able to follow procedures. So having those procedures simple and for people to understand is very, very important. You know, we're having internal dialogues about how to proceed in Florida among my fellow supervisor of elections and I. Should we advocate for all mail? Is that feasible in such a short time frame? Should we look at doing longer early voting period because they're larger facilities where we can space individuals out? We know this, that vote by mail is going to be a huge uptick in requests. I know a lot of groups are going to be promoting that as well. They should. So are we going to have a model of maybe a 3-week early voting vote center concept with vote by mail and not an election day traditional polling places? Will they go through election day? Will we have all vote by mail? It's not something you can hope for the best and decide in mid-August or mid-October. Obviously, those decisions need to be made now. So, you know, the importance of best practices, reaching out to your colleagues. I know one of my colleagues had a great idea. She reached out to her county administration, was able to, via text alert, reach about 3/4 of the county with vote by mail information. So being innovative is going to be a necessity, and just doing all you can and just make it work, quite honestly.
I think maybe you partially answered this question, but one of the people in the Q&A, Ellen, mentioned, you know, there are many populations who are absolutely vulnerable and they just may want to show up and vote in person for a whole set of reasons. And are there things that you're doing in particular to protect those vulnerable populations who actually may feel or need to actually vote in person? Anything else you want to
We're
add?
having those internal discussions. I know there's talk of, you know, I know individuals want, my poll workers want gloves, for example. And I know some of the research I've done, gloves are good. The problem is you don't realize how much you touch your face until you're told not to touch your face. And so when you have a glove and if you're handling stuff, say at a polling place, you're more likely to, that particular virus can actually stay longer on your glove. And if you touch your face, then that's problematic. So we're looking at masks and gloves and trying to further spread out our within our facilities, our machines, our poll workers as much as possible. But yeah, I'm cognizant of that. We do have also an option where voters in my jurisdiction can come to the Supervisor of Elections office, and instead of going to election day polling place, where they can come vote versus having to rely on vote by mail or going to a vote center. If they're concerned for any health reasons, I would strongly advocate voting by mail. My mom is 74 years old and has COPD, and I would literally beg Mom Corley to vote by mail versus going to a polling place where we are with this pandemic.
Great, Brian, thank you. I wonder, Sophie, I want to make sure that we have Barb's line open too, and we're going to start kind of having a little bit back and forth. So Barb, I want to know, you know, just to that same question about protecting vulnerable populations, anything you want to add from your perspective in your county vis-a-vis ensuring people's safety, particularly those who are more vulnerable for a whole set of reasons?
So I would personally strongly encourage them to vote by absentee ballot, vote by mail. I know that people enjoy going to the polling location, to their precinct to vote. I think that might decrease a bit when they realize how detrimental to their health that could be. But if they must, I would encourage them to go during non-peak times. So not when polls open, not when the majority of people get out of work at 5, not during lunch, and not right before polls close. In my college town, I had, because we have same-day voter registration, this is reasonably new, I had lines, and the last vote was cast at 10:25, polls closed at 8 o'clock. So that can tell you how close people were and how busy they were. And if people must go to the polls, I would encourage them to go during non-peak times. So 10 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but not during the peak times. But again, I would strongly encourage that they vote by absentee ballot. And in Michigan, they can also vote by absentee ballot at their clerk's office, at their local clerk's office. So if they don't want to deal with the mail and get the mail back and forth, they could go to their clerk's office and in person request an absentee ballot. Under the passage of Proposal 3, local clerk's offices are required to be open for 8 hours the weekend before the election. I would certainly be open to discussing that further and making them be open 8 hours the Saturday and Sunday at a minimum, and perhaps even the weekend before, to encourage that in-person absentee voting, to just get them in and out. They're not really going to the polls, they're going to their local clerk's office, but they can still get the picture in front of the banner that they voted. I would just encourage those voters to really consider not going to the precinct and just voting by absentee ballot.
Right, thank you. There's kind of two questions that are actually quite similar, so I'm going to read the slightly longer one, but I think it'll capture them. We'd love to have both your answers. So, I mean, how do you share best practices and new ideas with other election officials from your state and across the country? Are there clearinghouses, websites, groups like NAS and NASED, say election officials, MIT Election Data Center, whatever, that are trying to really make sure people are understanding all these nuances, these kind of tactical things that are super important, so there can be as much shared learning across kind of counties and states as we can? So what's your sense of that right now? Brian or Barb or both?
I'll go first if I may. Yeah, so I know within my state, we have 67 counties, and so there are 67 supervisor elections, and it's quite informal. It's not uncommon to get a phone call or an email, what do y'all think about this? We also have a large county caucus where we have the top 18 counties largest, and we meet quarterly, and that is the best time spent ever for me professionally, because I just take notes the whole time, and this county did this, that county did that. Nationally, there's the Election Center, IGO, and you develop friendships. That's, Barb and I were on a panel together, so we became friends, and so we've gone back and forth over some election-related issues, and so that's the epitomizes the phrase networking, I think, to some degree. You just develop friendships, and from there you bounce things off each other, and that begets good ideas.
Great. Barb, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I'd agree with Supervisor that it's the friendships that you develop through the association. So in Michigan, we have the Michigan Association of County Clerks. It's 83 county clerks, there's a huge variety in sizes of those counties. And then we have the Michigan Association of Municipal Clerks. Michigan, we have over 1,800 election officials. So there's a wealth of individuals, but the experiences, how people deal with hurricanes, how people are dealing with a fire at a precinct, that helps with those friendships, help talk about those continuation of plans. Working with election officials in other states, you hear how they implemented absentee voting or voting by mail when it first came out. So thankfully, I was linked up with some election officials from Colorado who were able to talk to me more about voting by mail and what kind of impact that's going to have in turnout, and when that turnout is going to be and what it's going to look like. But certainly NASED, Election Center, the Brennan Center, DHS has been very helpful, especially recently when it comes to cybersecurity in elections. It's a little area that I like to geek out with Brian on. And so there are opportunities to make those friendships and then phone a friend and talk things through. And I think that has been a real asset.
Great, thank you. Okay, I've got a question for each of you. So Barb, first for you. You're one of the 18 members of the renowned Michigan Election Security Commission established in March 2019. Did the coronavirus impact the recommendations of the commission provided to the secretaries of state to secure the elections and protect the integrity of every vote?
Not yet. It has not impacted our recommendations yet. We haven't met for a few months, and I don't know where we are yet with our recommendations. And so I look forward to a draft of those recommendations so I could provide feedback to the Bureau of Elections, Secretary of State's office before we make those official recommendations.
Right, thanks, Barb. And Brian, for you, I think the same question we asked Barb, but same to you, is, what is your sense in Florida? Do the big urban counties have the capacity and systems to process the surge of absentee requests, or I guess in your case, it's vote by mail, and the ballots are going to likely come in versus in-person polling? What is your sense of the capacity to handle this potential change in Florida?
I've talked to some of my colleagues. There's a concern that their capacity is not there. Part of the issue is in Florida, we have a very tight timeline for certification. And based on those timelines, it would be very difficult. If you're Miami-Dade, where you have, 1 million plus voters, 1.4 million voters, and you're getting a 6 or 8 page ballot, and you're getting back, 70, 80, 100,000 the day before the election and the day of, that's a lot to tabulate in literally a couple of days. And also in a Florida law, the voters are required to have it back to our office by 7 p.m. on election day. And so you can't be postmarked, for example, and that would be a problem as well. That's one of we're having those internal dialogues because there's a little bit of a concern about overcommitting to all vote by mail. There's some larger counties that are not so sure, given the current timelines, they can meet those certification deadlines. And so that's why some are advocating for a hybrid of a vote center concept, with knowing that vote by mail is going to have a sharp uptick in request utilization anyway, and make it a hybrid of both a vote center concept with early voting expansion and also vote by mail versus having a complete all vote by mail concept. So we're having those discussions now, obviously.
Right. So here's a two-part question. It's maybe first for Barb and then for both of you. And if you can't answer the question because of election law, totally fine. So Barb, for question for you is, even if the state can't essentially mail out ballots without a request, could the county just mail out ballots themselves, whether or not the state feels they can do it?
No, there are all sorts of rules to make it as difficult for election officials to engage voters, my interpretation. So the county clerk is not permitted to mail out an absentee ballot application to a voter, even if it's self-addressed to the local clerk. We're not permitted to do that. There is question on whether or not the Secretary of State is even permitted to do that. The governor and the Secretary of State are doing that for the May special. I trust that they're doing everything above board, but there are some concerns. Because Michigan is such a home rule state, the interaction with the voter for the purposes of voting has to come from that local clerk. So it's the local clerk that has to send the application for an absentee ballot, and it's the local clerk that is supposed to receive that application back, and then it's the local clerk that sends the ballot. I don't have ballots in my possession. I do all the programming of the elections, the ordering of the ballots, the ballot layout, all of that. The ballots go directly to the locals, and then the locals keep all of those ballots, mail them out to the voters and such. So Michigan election law doesn't allow for coordination, quite frankly. There are some county clerks that are permitted to do the qualified voter file, the data entry for the voters, but that is on a very limited basis, and that is that is for those county clerks that have, they're small counties and they have tiny local clerks, tiny jurisdiction local clerks. I am not permitted to do the data entry for that purpose. Under some emergencies, I have been granted access. For example, in East Lansing this past presidential primary, some of my staff had been granted access to assist with the same day voter registration, but that access was immediately turned off that night when everything was over. So it's very difficult for Michigan to afford much coordination. I know the Michigan Association of County Clerks has worked on legislation and talked to their legislators about allowing local municipalities, local city and township clerks to work together for the purpose of running an election for the absentee ballot mail election part. That hasn't gotten much traction. But I think in the very near future, we're going to see a lot of changes in Michigan election law to allow coordination out of necessity.
Right, very good. And then this is kind of related, but a broader question, which is, do you know, are there states in which essentially the governor by executive order can essentially mandate vote by mail? Is there any way in which a governor has that authority in a state, or is it really guided by statute in a way they rarely have that authority?
Well, it kind of happened for my May special election in Michigan. The Governor Whitmer with Secretary of State Benson worked together. There was an executive order. Secretary of State Benson mailed out applications for absentee ballots to all qualified registered voters in the counties in which they have a May special election. It's my understanding that those requests already have a self-addressed portion on there, so they would go to the local clerks. I do worry about those local clerks all of a sudden receiving all of those applications, and if they're going to be able to keep up, I think some of those local clerks may need assistance with the data entry and the processing of those requests and getting those ballots out timely to voters, but we shall see.
Great. Good. Brian, anything else to add to that?
No, in Florida, it's the governor does have some latitude, kind of a catch-all phrase, but it's been brought to my attention if the governor were to mandate, for example, all mail ballot, you'd probably see some litigation, questioning that, and it would probably be worked out by the courts.
Great. Thanks, Brian. All right, I've got at least two more questions for everybody. So as you all know, there have been many election and voting commissions and the like, usually to fix the problem of the last election, whatever it might be, whether it's long lines or hanging chads or whatever it might be. Curious whether any of those recommendations from those panels and commissions over the last 20 years have been helpful through all of this as you face this new challenge, or actually some of the recommendations are now proving to be unhelpful just because they didn't ever think of, understandably, this particular issue.
Barb, you want to go first?
Sure. So the recommendations in regards to long lines. Michigan, we have a certain number of qualified registered voters that are assigned to a polling location, which has helped, but that's all out the window right now with no reason absentee voting. So there is discussion to increase the number of voters assigned to a polling location. So that's lines, and there was something else I've already forgotten. The recommendations.
That's right. That was a good example.
Okay.
Brian, anything else that comes to mind for you?
Well, I couldn't help but notice, Pat, when you said hanging chads, you looked right at my picture on the bottom.
I did.
It's so hurtful, but so true. No, the recommendations, probably indirectly, you look at like PICA, you look at the Bipartisan Policy Center, you look at David Becker and the CEIR, a lot of good stuff happening there. There's been a lot of recommendations. Barb alluded to long lines. You want to avoid long lines, vote by mail. So I don't know if directly those recommendations have been overly helpful this time. I think the problem is we're still going through it and we're still assessing our next step for the fall. So we're gonna factor all those in, but I can't say it was a direct correlation.
Great, thank you. All right, probably as we begin, we're approaching the 12:30 time. So what I want to do is take at least two more questions that we have. So first one is in Israel's March 2nd, 2020 national elections, thousands of Israelis quarantined due to possible exposure to COVID and voted in special polling places set up to allow them to safely cast their ballots, even though they were either had or were potentially exposed to the virus. Trained paramedics dressed in full head-to-toe protective gear, essentially head-to-toe protective gear, including gloves and masks, staffed the polling locations. Voters were counted by election officials also dressed in protective gear. Is this setup possible in your county, Barb, in your county, Brian? What about actually those folks who are, again, either exposed to or have the virus? Could you set up special, unique polling places or centers for them?
No, short answer, no. I'll tell you, in fact, I mentioned that we're having three municipal elections on the 14th, and I've got a little bit of pushback from asking to delay those, and to which I replied to the particular individual candidate, we have, first and foremost, the safety has to come first, and health of the citizens. Second to that, we have my poll workers that are going to be there and putting themselves in danger and peril. And then my staff. So it's not just the voters, it's all of those. In Florida, we had several counties where it turns out the poll workers were, in fact, COVID-19 positive on election day, were asymptomatic. And so they had to notify all the voters that went to that polling place. And so if it comes down to possibly, it's not to sound grandiose, but possibly killing you, others have died for our right to vote, but we shouldn't die voting in and of itself. If it comes down to that need, you have the vote by mail option. Stay away. It's just not worth it. We want everyone to vote, but for the love of God, we want everyone to be healthy and survive. That has to be factored into the whole equation, I think.
Barb, what's the possibility of Michigan kind of suiting up, so to speak, for a certain kind of voter?
I think in Michigan, anything is possible. I have gone out of my way to make sure people are afforded the opportunity to exercise their right to vote, even those that aren't even in my county. I would certainly encourage them to vote via absentee ballot. Right now, going to the grocery store, most people in my state are following the CDC guidelines, and we are wearing masks when we are out of the house. And I think I think we are treating everyone as though they are positive, and that we too may be positive for the interest of public health. And I think anything is possible. I would certainly commit to going above and beyond to make sure every qualified registered voter is afforded their opportunity to exercise that right, whether they are in the hospital or have tested positive for COVID-19. I think they should always be afforded the opportunity to exercise their right to vote.
Great, thank you. here's maybe one last question, which is there any useful role for technical and or financial assistance funded by philanthropy to help counties, locals prepare for the expected surge in vote by mail, paper procurement, equipment processing, poll workers, whatever? You know, what role can philanthropy play here in the coming months up to November?
There is a tremendous need. My locals could certainly utilize high-speed tabulators, additional tabulators. I know some of my locals in Ingham County actually ordered them, but they were on back order because another large state, Georgia, ordered the same product. And so they were the primary because they had an election sooner. We can always use more staff, especially on election day, those precinct workers, those election workers. They are paid not much. But we need them, and we need more tech savvy ones at that. And printing ballots is expensive, and mailing ballots is expensive. The cost of running elections is only going to go up, whether we are in the middle of a pandemic or not, because now we are affording voters, at least in Michigan, more opportunities to exercise their right to vote, and it's expensive. It comes with a cost.
Brian, anything to add to that?
What Barb said, spot on.
Thanks.
Maybe all hands on deck, both in terms of people and resources to try to do well enough in November. What I want to do is I want to just briefly turn it to Russell and see, Russell, if there's any kind of final questions or things you want to note as we begin to close our webinar by 12:30 East Coast time today. So Russell, I want to turn it over to you for at least a minute.
Yeah, hopefully folks can hear me. This has been so great. I think we both heard some really practical things that both of these folks are doing, and also the uncertainty ahead as this plays out. And what's helpful to me is to hear the challenges around a surge in absentee or vote by mail, depending on the structure in a state, can be a great solution, but it comes with attached challenges, both around funding, around logistics, needing more poll workers. I've seen some folks put forward creative things like having more young adults trained to volunteer at polls, which I think, could be really good. There's also a nice civic education and engagement piece of that too, as far as a lifelong connection to voting that could be great for someone who's 20 when a lot of the poll volunteers and workers are often older folks. I wanted to ask, this has just been so rich. We're really grateful to Barb and Brian. I wanted to ask if there's anybody else that should be a part of the conversation as we think about solutions who maybe isn't now. We got to that a little bit in the last question around could philanthropy creatively jump in? But is there anyone else you all would say you'd love to hear from or have their support, or that groups like Convergence that convene people could pull together to think about solutions? Are there other players to have in the mix, or do you sort of have the support that you need at this point? If there's just any short thoughts on that question.
Well, I'll just jump in here. There's so many stakeholders, as we all know, with elections administration, the most important being the voters. I'd be curious if any polling's been done or outreach to hear from those that are impacted the most. We heard about the possibility of those coming out to vote in almost like hazmat suit environments. And I said not to be sarcastic, but truthfully, what are voters' expectations? Are they wanting to go all vote? We've heard from those in Washington and policymakers, but I'd be curious to know the voters' perspective, what they want. I'm wondering if that's ever been included recently.
Good question.
Yeah, I like that. Barb, anything else you want to say?
I think Brian covered it. I think
Yeah.
he did a good job covering
Yay.
it.
Terrific. You guys have been a dynamic duo. Well, it strikes me in closing that regardless of the additional changes or just the ramping up of the current options that happen, the public will need significant education. And I know there are many people on this webinar today who can be a part of that, whether you yourself are going to administer an election or if you work in some outside sphere. We all need to make sure the public understands what's available to them and feels like they have good information and then is confident in the result if the number of ballots cast this November is a lot higher through the mail than in the past, which seems very likely, in addition to populations that will continue to vote early or in person on election day. So I think we all have a role to play in creatively thinking about how to get those messages out and educate the public, which is another really critical piece of this, so that folks can avail themselves of their rights, and that when the dust settles, they feel like we ran a really good, transparent election, even if the processes were a little bit different than they've been in the past. Well, with that, why don't we close? Thanks to everybody, especially our speakers. We may have our contact information on the screen, but if not, I think you all know how to reach us, but Omar, myself, Russell, others on the Convergence team, and Pat at CBI would welcome the chance to hear from anybody on the call that wants to reach out with your comments, your questions, your desire to speak to us, or to help us continue to shape our work going forward. If this was useful, let us know. We may hold more of these between now and the general election that have more of a timely and urgent agenda, and let other people come together as experts and speakers and continue to sort of foster a learning community. With that, thanks everybody. Stay safe and healthy. Appreciate your time today. Pat, do you want to say a closing word there?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just going to say, I think if you do have actually final ideas for other webinars we'd like to have, particular topics you'd like to be covered, and wanted to add those in the chat function, please do, and we'll take those with us and see what we can do. So thank you so much.
Terrific.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.